really look forward to an engaging conversation to continue the framing that Deputy Secretary Raskin provided for us on why the issue of inequality and opportunity is important and why it's a topic that business should engage in. So let me quickly introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to do a very brief summary of the report that CE did, and then we'll open up to a conversation. Detailed bios for each of our panelists, which are quite distinguished in both their research and specific activity related to this topic, are in your materials. So I'm not going to do a very detailed introduction of each of them, just to describe what their background is, and then we'll get into it. So from my left to my far left, and from your right to your far right, seated next to me is Anu Madgavkar, who is a partner with the McKinsey Global Institute, McKinsey's business and research arm. She is here for the week from India. Her research focuses on global issues, and she's leading a report on behalf of the McKinsey Global Institute on global inequality, so we'll be hearing from her shortly. Next to her is Sandra Black. Sandra is a member of the Council of Economic Advisors for the President, where she is today on leave from the University of Texas, Austin, where she is an economics professor and a chair of the economics and public policy affairs, public affairs work there. Her expertise, and we'll be talking a little bit more about today, is on early life experiences, the outcomes of children, and issues of gender and discrimination. So look forward to that conversation. Thank you for joining us. And next to her is Janis Bowdler. Janis is a managing director with the global philanthropy piece of the JPMorgan Chase and Company Bank. They're a global leader in corporate philanthropy, donating more than $200 million investing, not donating, investing in communities annually. She's joined the global philanthropy team in 2013, where she focuses on the areas of financial capability, small business, and community development. So thank you for joining us. And last, and certainly not least, is George Barrett. George is the chairman and CEO of Cardinal Health, who I'm sure you all know of. It's the 26th largest member of the Fortune 500. George leads the firm and is focused on improving the cost effectiveness of healthcare. So please join me in welcoming a distinguished panel to have this conversation. So as Steve Odland mentioned, CED just released a report called on how U.S. business can help tackle inequality and encourage opportunity. As chair of the Policy and Impact Committee, I'm especially proud of this work because it continues the long tradition of CED of stepping ahead of issues, encouraging evidence-based and nonpartisan policymaking, and putting the front foot forward where business is in a position of leading a conversation, not being reactive. I encourage you to read the report in detail. There is also a very good Fortune editorial that was written by Larry Thompson, Patrick Gross, and Bo Cutter that describes it, but essentially it makes the argument that it's hard to, as the Deputy Secretary said, shy away from the fact that there has been a substantial growth in inequality in the United States, and that it is incumbent on business leaders to engage in this issue in a way that focuses the attention on policy interventions that will really improve the opportunity for those who need it most. Many of these topic areas and focus of intervention, CED is authoritative on, having written extensively on most of them during the course of their work on issues that we have been paying attention to for a while. Topics like early education, ensuring that business is together with our members of the labor community focusing on improving K-12 education, ensuring that their businesses are simultaneously improving the talent pools that they're accessing, trying to work with our post-secondary institutions to focus on competencies that are relevant for those jobs of the future. Also thinking about reemploying those that have long-term unemployment. What can business do to help engage with those populations? But also believing that this is an issue that is going to require policy intervention. Topic areas that ensure that opportunity is more broadly spread include things like ensuring that we bring into continued focus the importance of reining in healthcare inflation, which is the single largest factor of take-home pay for most workers, the deductions for healthcare, and that there are important issues to be done in tax and regulatory issues, including a call for the expansion of the earned income tax credit. So there's much more detail in this report. I just wanted to give you a very brief overview of it, encourage you to read it, engage in it, and the response from our members has been universally encouraging, under a belief that this is an issue that, as we said, business should engage in and help take the lead on addressing. So with that, let me start the conversation with our panelists, and then we're going to leave some time towards the tail end of this for some Q&A. But let me start with you, Sandra. So that's a cold call, so be ready. So you have been doing a lot of research both in your academic career and now with the Council of Economic Advisors, trying to understand what's going on in this topic here. What is really going on with inequality and what is driving it? And in particular, if you could touch a little bit on some of the work that you've been doing on diversity and inclusiveness. Okay. And if your microphone doesn't work, I'll trade you.
I don't know how to turn it on. Okay. Great. Oh, great. Thank you so much. So as was mentioned, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I think we know a lot about what's been going on to the extent that there are a number of factors. So what we see is prior to the 1980s, the US looked like a lot of other countries. As recently as 1975, the top 1% got the same share of income in the United States as the other G7 countries, and it's in the 1980s where we really see the divergence. And so in the 1980s, if you look at inequality, you see this dramatic widening of inequality, and what happened in the US is pronounced compared to what happened in other developed countries. Moreover, the United States has continued to diverge further from other advanced countries, with the top 1%'s income share rising 0.2 percentage point a year on average in the US from 1990 to 2010, well above the 0.1 percentage point average increase in the UK. And so the question becomes, why did this happen? And I think part of the problem, so we have a lot of explanations, and I think they're all kind of true. And so the question is kind of what's the relative magnitude of each of these? And so starting in the 1980s, people were thinking about it from this competitive argument. So if workers are paid their marginal productivity, what's been going on that makes some workers becoming much more productive relative to others? And that's the competitive argument. And so the research has really focused on things like technological change, so that's a really big focus. The idea that it's skill biased, so it's helping skilled workers more than unskilled. And it's not obvious that it would be skill biased. There's a lot of technology that helps actually increase the productivity of unskilled workers. But the argument for the increased inequality is that it was skill biased. There was increasing globalization, educational changes, and in particular, labor market institutions that were changing. And that idea that the real value of the minimum wage was going down, unionization was going down, those were kind of the differences that people perceived between the US and other countries, kind of explaining why the US had such a different experience. And unfortunately, we don't know which of these. We think they're all probably kind of true and have some component. What's interesting today is that now people are thinking about it from a little more of a non-competitive perspective, where it's this idea that some firms are earning rents in the market. And when we talk about rents in economics, what we mean is the capital, the money that's paid to either labor or capital above what is necessary to keep that labor at work or that capital invested. So kind of, we say you should get kind of a reasonable return, and the rents are anything above that reasonable return. And so what we see in the data is it seems like firms are getting more rents, and that these rents are being shared unequally. So it would be one thing if everyone was benefiting from these, and we would see everyone doing better. It seems like these rents may be shared disproportionately with capital owners who are more at the top of the distribution and less at the bottom. There's also evidence that when there are rents, they may be shared disproportionately with men and women or different groups. And so that too is another kind of possible explanation for what's going on. And as you can imagine, they all are interacting together, and they all have really different proposed policy responses.
Okay, great. Thank you for helping frame the topic here. So Anu, you have been taking a look at the issue of inequality, both from a global lens and also from a generational lens. So what are you finding about what's going on, and what are the consequences of not doing something about this for generations?
Sure. As we think about it, if you can really frame or understand inequality in three ways based on how it really impacts people. So the most basic way is really the idea of not getting by, which is that inequality really leads to people being trapped in poverty. And this is the dominant aspect of inequality in much of the developing world, clearly in Africa and India and South Asia, earlier in China. And while poverty hasn't been eliminated in the advanced economies, we would think that it's contained and it's relatively stable. There hasn't been an explosion in poverty. So that's really the first lens. The second lens to inequality is the idea of not catching up, which is really about the concentration of income and wealth in the top 1% or the top 5%, and the notion that there is a widening gap. And this has been the dominant view of inequality, or the dominant issue that has concerned the advanced economies in the last 2 decades or so. And while it was certainly true that these gaps were widening, what was also true for the earlier part of this period was that all households generally saw some growth in real income. It may have been sluggish growth, it may have been slower than the richest in the income distribution, but there was growth. There was a sense that I will get materially better over a generation than perhaps my parents were. Now, that's a belief or a conviction that's being fundamentally challenged at this point based on the experience in the last 10 years. And by our estimates, we think that about 500 million people, about 60 to 70% of the population of the advanced economies, the US and the European economies, are earning market incomes today which are the same as or less than what their peers or people like them earned 10 years ago. So these are cohorts. If you think about the median household today across the advanced economies, that median household is earning either no more than or actually significantly less than what a similar household earned 10 years ago. So the sense that you can progress, that you can advance, is actually being shattered. And that has implications clearly for consumption growth, for recovery or the stability of the recovery, but it also has social and political implications in terms of a sense of alienation from the system, that it doesn't really work for us anymore.
Okay, that's very helpful. George, you are in the middle of these issues as a CEO, whether you like it or not. What's your perspective on why the business community should engage, and what's your experience been on the topic?
Well, I think Deputy Secretary and Steve both highlighted this issue of business engagement. There's sort of a long view and a short view of it. And you can take a moral perspective, economic perspective, and I think it still holds. I think in the broader sense, those of us who are in business, we recognize, again, the Secretary said that most of our economic progress comes from the middle out. So we're all dependent on some kind of consumption as business, and consumption is a byproduct of this opportunity people feel to move from one state of economic health to another. When that stalls, that is an unhealthy phenomenon. I would add a sort of another lens to this, and then I'll come back to the why should business. The other lens is this, and we see it in our political discourse. At a time where many, and I guess for the moment I'll focus in the US, because there's a global phenomenon as well, but in the US, at a time where many feel left back at a moment where others are advancing dramatically, that builds a very unhealthy dynamic in society. You can call it frustration, you can call it anger. We see it, as I said, in our political discourse. It has broad implications for the way we see our institutions. So the basic trust that we have in our institutions, if you ask most Americans, whether it's in CEOs or their health system or their university or the government, that trust is breaking down. The byproduct of that breakdown in trust is typically a reaction that is not healthy, and it can wind up in bad policy that is reflexive rather than thoughtful. And so I think we actually have a reason to be thoughtful about this and to care about this and to care about the impact that it's having on not just the economic behavior of our country, but the discussion that we have as a society between ourselves and our institutions. And that is breaking down. I think it's a damaging phenomenon. I think for those of us in business, and certainly those of us in the CEO seat, this can be treacherous space to talk about. It is easy to cause the reflexive eye rolling. It's easy for you to discuss economic inequality or inequality of opportunity when you're thriving. I don't think that's an answer for hiding. And it is a temptation. And when I speak to peers, they care about this and they understand the broad implications. But it is it's particularly now in this environment, it is a harrowing thing to talk about in public. I think and Steve mentioned it, we should not be shying away from it. It affects all of us, and it affects the health of our country. So I think we've got a very good reason to engage, and I'd encourage more business leaders to engage in it.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to come back to you again about what your experience has been in trying to do that. But let me bring Janis into this conversation. So JPMorgan Chase is a major player in basically every community in the United States. And you have a major initiative and set of initiatives that are trying to work on these issues. So why do you do that? Why is it a business, a moral imperative? And what are you finding that are initiatives that you think are making a difference?
Sure. Well, I can certainly relate. I mean, in terms of the stepping into treacherous waters, if you're going to talk about this from a financial institution perspective, yes, commence eye rolling. That happens to us a lot. And certainly we are still in a place where we're regaining trust and rebuilding reputation in a lot of communities where we're working. But we've really embraced it. That's no reason to hide. And in fact, I don't know, this room probably doesn't know me as well. If you read my bio, you know I'm sitting in an unlikely seat with a 15-year background in civil rights. I now am leading strategies at JPMorgan Chase to make a difference in communities. I'm really proud of this work, but I say that to say that, sure, you might expect to hear Janis Bowdler up here talking about why we should all care about inequality and why in particular we should care about the racial wealth gap. I'll come back to that later. But it's not just me saying this. In fact, I'm here and doing this work because Jamie Dimon has been emphatic about this is, if we are going to be taken seriously as a corporate citizen involved in the fabric of our societies, we need to be responsive to this issue. So we do see it as both a moral and, yes, an economic imperative. I think that is clear to everybody in this room that these are our future customers. A bank does well when our communities are doing well. So there's clearly an enlightened self-interest for us here. I want to take the conversation from some of the macro levels and zoom down to the ground. And some of the work that we've been doing is really focused on the way that inequality plays out on the ground. Right now, one of the biggest determinants of a child's life outcomes is their zip code. Where you're born matters. And that seems to me to be fundamentally at odds with what we think of as the American dream and what we all espouse to. We know from recent research from Raj Chetty and his colleagues at Harvard, he's now at Stanford, that a totality of factors in a neighborhood conspire to keep poverty in place and make it difficult for a child to experience economic mobility. So we just launched an initiative, $125 million over 5 years, to focus on driving capital specifically into distressed communities. We're doing that through CDFI partners. We're focusing on new ways to finance affordable housing that are less reliant on public subsidy, because that is just not going to meet the demand of what we need. And new data and analytics tools, because cities are right now trying to figure out how to react to these issues looking at trends data that go back 20 years when in fact your demographics are changing under your feet and it's hard to respond real time to blight or gentrification and apply your resources in an effective way when you can't forecast what's coming at you. So that's the, could talk your ear off all day about that work, but that's how we're coming at it from a community perspective. We thread together 3 other things that I think are really important to the conversation. One is on workforce and helping to look at middle-skilled jobs. We look at financial capability and kind of individual financial security, and we do a lot of work on small businesses. The reason why I take you through all of the things we do is, and maybe this leads into a different part of the conversation, but we've also, not only have we said that we want to play in this in a big way, and we're committing $200 million a year. We will invest $1 billion over the next 5 years globally into these issues. But these are areas where JPMorgan Chase has expertise. So when we come to the table, we could have tackled any number of issues, but we identified issues where we can bring more than just our dollars. We bring people with a skill set and a deep knowledge in each of these areas that we can use to further support the communities where we're working.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks for all JPMorgan Chase is doing on those topics. So I'm going to suggest that for the remainder of this conversation, before we open up to the audience, that we're just going to stipulate that we all agree with the CED report that this is an issue that business should engage in and not have that part of the conversation. What I want to now turn to is what should we do? What can we do as business leaders, within our own companies, within our own communities? What can we do as policymakers to make a difference in these? So what I'm going to ask each of you is, what are the top couple of things that you think we should be doing? And to the extent you've had experience trying to work on those, what's it like? So I'm going to go the opposite direction this time. So George, you want to start?
Yeah, so there are things that we can do, and I think it's sort of top down and bottom up. I'm going to start though with the bottom up because I think it's really powerful. It goes to what Janis was talking about. As you well know, it is hard to get things moving here in the nation's capital, especially in the current moment. But incredible things are happening around the country and local communities. Our headquarters is just outside Columbus, Ohio. We have, like many cities, had an enormous challenge in our inner city public schools. That is a subject that for many years the business community said, look, it's such a challenging, vexing problem. There are probably others better equipped to do that. And over the last couple of years, we said that's an unacceptable response, that we actually need to be involved in that. And the mayor asked me to co-chair a commission on education reform in Columbus. And from that work, and I'll come a little bit to the response to that, we formed a sort of public-private partnership called Future Ready Columbus. And it tried to sort of mimic some work we did in economic development. And basically the concept was to work side by side with the public school system to make sure that every kid, regardless of zip code, had the opportunity for development. And we had to decide where we could have impact. There are a couple of areas that we've worked very, very hard at. One is early education. That was not just about aligning the school systems, it was actually getting the nonprofits to agree because we were doing parallel play, as they say in education. And so aligning our work so that we're actually targeting things. So for example, social and emotional competencies are tremendously powerful at the early stages. And actually you can overcome enormous problems of zip code and poverty by intervening early at those stages. We've talked a lot about, we've worked on partnerships with businesses so that students might be able to do apprenticeships or programs in high school with businesses to provide an opportunity to come out of school with some jobs. So that's the kind of work that can be done. Some of the challenges go back to this trust issue. When we first launched this commission, and the commission had nonprofits, it had policymakers, it had educators, and it had a few business folks. There was a natural, almost reflexive resistance to the business involvement that it was going to be a takeover of the school system. It's really interesting. Total byproduct of this breakdown in trust. And so we've had to learn over the course of these couple of years working at this that we almost have to start with the trust issue and work our way back into being able to be part of this discourse. But I think it's a powerful model. It's early, and we're ready to engage in it. The other thing I would argue is this. Our employees want to see us involved in the big issues of the day, and particularly millennials, so that our people feel proud and more engaged when we're involved in issues that matter to society in a bigger sense. So that's sort of a quick overview.
Excellent, thank you. So, Janis, you mentioned some of the areas that you're working in. Can you give us some examples of things that you're really excited about, that you're feeling like that has real promise to make a difference on these issues?
Sure. So I'm going to do both. I want to pick up on something that you said, and then I'll answer that question. One is you all are thinking about what you can contribute to this challenge. Drawing on your organizational and corporate expertise, I think, is really important. And then integrating into whatever initiative, whether it's a national coalition or it's local action items, so that you're not working in a vacuum, is incredibly important. So what we've seen works really well is that we have to break down silos at a local level. The old way to do this was, we had an affordable housing crowd, and they were adamant on, we need to build a certain amount of units, and we're going to go after fair housing policy. But the education people were way over there, and they probably didn't know each other. The people working on workforce didn't know anything about financial capability, and in getting people into new jobs, they missed one of the most important moments to get people signed up for retirement accounts and get people banked. And so where I think we see the most promise is when we're able to break down silos at the operational level and see a number of programs come together. And in fact, most of my work over the years has been in community development. This has been a real challenge. Thinking about housing policy in isolation from anything else has actually just left us with concentrated poverty. We have to be thinking about it in an integrated way. And then the other thing I'd say is that we have to think about both the short term and the long term. So I think, again, for people in this room, part of the question is, what can we do right now? And in fact, a lot of us are in a position to be able to do something in the near term, while also thinking about the policy changes, which are really the long game, because that takes a really long time to make those things happen.
Okay, excellent. So Sandra, policy is important in all of this.
Yes.
I know we're all looking for complete resolution and alignment in Washington next week on all these issues, but
I look forward to that as well.
But short of that happening, where do you see momentum and opportunity on the policy front, either here or things that you are seeing that are happening around the country that you think hold some promise?
So I think there is a lot of hope and promise, and I think sometimes we don't think about it as much. So we've already made progress, and that's something I think we don't focus on. So the Affordable Care Act has really, helped people at the bottom of the income distribution. We've expanded the EITC and made those expansions permanent. There have been kind of more investment in training and apprenticeships, and so there are things that we have been doing, but I agree that it isn't enough yet. We still need to push forward. There are some things that when the federal government doesn't seem to be moving on things like minimum wage, access to paid leave, you do see states kind of taking that up and doing that, and those are going to help people so that they don't have to leave the labor force when they get sick or have a child. And so I think there have been a lot of areas where states have been picking up when the federal government is not doing it. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do and are working on, and there's been focus. The Council of Economic Advisors, as a plug to our economic report of the president, had a whole chapter on investing in opportunity in early childhood, so for 5 and younger, and the importance, as was noted, that if you invest then, there are real benefits in the long run, and we're losing productive capacity from a pure business, if you take out the moral argument from a pure productive perspective, people who don't have the opportunity to get the skills that they should are not going to be as productive as they can be, and we're missing out on these resources as an economy. So.
Okay, great. That's a good segue to you, Janis. You've been spending a lot of time thinking about generational opportunity, and while I know you're still only partway through the work, what are you seeing that you think holds promise for helping encourage generational opportunity so that the next generation has as much enthusiasm for the future as we did?
Absolutely. I think one of the potentially less gloomy findings from the work is actually that policy does make a difference. Policy does matter, and the evidence is actually perhaps quite interesting in that there is a lot of variation across countries in terms of how governments have used taxes and transfers to actually mitigate the worst effects of the markets really not working and creating opportunities for middle and low-skilled workers. If you think about the US, for example, this concept of flat or falling market incomes, which has affected 70% of the US population groups, has been completely mitigated by our data based on the efforts to actually transfer through unemployment benefits and social security and healthcare benefits and food stamps. If you just add up all of that, it was enough to actually keep everyone a little bit above water. So enough to kind of sustain that perhaps very, very modest growth, but at least not have a crash in incomes. So policy does matter, but the question is when markets aren't working, how long can redistributive policies actually sustain this? And therefore, we do come to the question around what can businesses do in order to make market opportunities work better for younger people. Younger and less educated people have actually been the worst affected by this. I think the points made around education, skilling, and apprenticeship models, or making education in high school +1 kind of more job relevant, and really creating collaborations of industry and local governments to make that happen is critical. And in this regard, I just want to share another perspective from our gender inequality work, which is also a huge economic cost and opportunity, depending on how you look at it. In the US, our estimates were that there's a $2 trillion incremental GDP opportunity that comes from narrowing gender equality gaps. But what is really interesting about the work in the US as well as globally is that if you think about all the elements of gender equality in the workplace, they are very highly correlated with gender equality in society. And this is true across 95 countries in the world. This is true across 50 states in the US. There is a high correlation, and unless, therefore, businesses really expand their ambit or their focus beyond just thinking about these issues in the context of their own workplace, but going out into society and addressing issues like how do you really equip single mothers, how do you really make the city a safer place to work, how do you think about interventions around gender-based violence, education gaps, financial inclusion gaps, you're not really going to make much headway on the core economic front. So there really is a convergence of the two.
Fantastic. So we're going to open it up for audience questions in about 5 minutes here, but I want to do a lightning round for everyone to give you the opportunity to say you're giving a piece of advice to a room full of leaders. We're not passively sitting here saying we're waiting for you to do something. What advice would you have, and what do you think is the one or two things that if you walk away from this room today you should be doing? You want to start, Anu, just to mix it up?
I just think for us across all the inequality work, I think the big idea is that collaboration across businesses and the policy leader space and the social sector space. So tri-sector collaborations, though they're complicated, messy, and slow, and it's hard to kind of build alignment and real progress, but I don't think we really have an option to tackle problems like inequality, which have deep sort of social as well as economic angles. So the more we can collaborate and cooperate, the better, hard as it is.
Okay.
So I would highlight the benefits of diversity, that as a society, we are a diverse society, and by not giving everyone opportunities, we're missing out on great opportunities.
Oh, I was actually going to say that, but let me take it a step further and actually put a fine point on that. And I would encourage the room not to shy away from the tough issues on whether it's on gender or whether it's on race. That is a critical element. When we didn't get into some of the specifics on inequality, but acutely felt when you slice the data by gender or by race and ethnicity. And if you're not going to acknowledge that up front, you will get the eye rolling, and you will continue to face those trust barriers. So I would encourage folks on that. And then the second piece of advice I'd give is bring more than your check. The folks you sit around the table with in your local communities, they already expect that you're coming there with money. Like that's probably the reason why they called you up, right? But when you start bringing your people and your talent and contributing some time to these problems, that not only is that, as big. I mean, quick sidebar, I know this is supposed to be the lightning round, but we have a $100 million commitment in the city of Detroit. We have sent Service Corps workers. We've drawn from our employee base across the globe and sent teams of 3 to spend 3 weeks with nonprofits working in the city. And Mayor Duggan said that that has been as effective or more effective than the dollars that we brought to the table. So I really encourage you to think about what else you bring besides dollars to the problem.
Well, this is probably repetitive, but engagement. And I'm going to say imagination. Treat this like any other huge strategy problem that we're wrestling with, and that requires working across boundaries and knocking them down systematically. I want to just give a real quick example. We know that just in the U.S., 60-some-odd% of graduates of pharmacy schools are women, and yet the percentage of women who own pharmacies is very tiny. So our people organized a program to get women into actually owning their own pharmacies, and it's creating this actual opportunity. So just an example, I think the other broad thing is that we have this multidisciplinary need to sort of work at the boundary level and figure out what those points of resistance are and sort of hack away at them. And so I would again, my argument would be imagination, engagement, and sort of working at the boundary points where there resistance.
Okay, terrific. Great advice. So we have time for a couple of questions, and I don't know who has the mics, so someone's going to have to point right up here. There's right in the front.
Hi, thank you very much for a very powerful presentation. My name is Paula Stern, a member of CED, and a former chair of the U.S. International Trade Commission, and working closely with the National Center for Women and Information Technology in CWIT. And I would particularly like to ask for Dr. Black to expand on what I thought was a wonderful list of accomplishments, including the apprenticeship programs, investment, Obamacare passage, making the earned income tax credit permanent, and then investing in early childhood experiments. What you think of what we need to do with our trade adjustment program to deal with skilling, middle skills, and all the way up, for those both entering the workforce and impacted by technology, if not trade. How would you design the best that would be successfully passed, as you've just described with these others?
Okay, the last part is a hard one, but I think that's a really good point, that the skills that we need today are different than the skills that we needed 20 years ago, and technology and globalization, all kinds of things are happening. One of the things that was proposed in the budget that I thought was really the way to be thinking about it is a link between businesses and community colleges, or kind of the local education system, where community colleges can respond to the needs of businesses and offer the programs for, not just young students, but also retraining people who are affected by changes in the labor market. And so those kinds of programs, and I think this is kind of nice for this group, because one of the proposals was that, provide incentives for firms to partner with community colleges and then get a credit for rehiring some of those workers who are then trained with the skills that the business needs. So I think that kind of partnership is exactly what we need in this kind of environment.
Can I touch on that for a second? Connect these two dots? So think about, again, this goes back to imagination. We have a population in the United States that by 2022 we'll have 20 million people over the age of 80. Okay, 20 million people. How are they going to be cared for? They're not going to be in hospitals. We have a generation of kids who are 13, 14, 15 who could be trained to be caregivers in the home. What we have to do, and it's powerful, it's a societal need, there's opportunity, it doesn't require 10 years of training. We need to align that need with policy. What are the incentives to sort of help that happen? Right now, there are none, by the way, to actually really make that happen. But that would be an example where we could develop a program with a community college or even at a high school to help train young people to be working in the home to support a huge population of people that are going to need tremendous care.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I can't tell where the mic is. Okay. Please.
Carolyn Chin, former trustee. I think it was Churchill that said that Americans eventually get it right after they've tried everything else. And Tom Friedman is the one that has said that we just don't have the margin of error anymore. Is there anything that's being said by the presidential candidates that can give us a source of encouragement that we may be heading in the right direction?
Okay, who wants to tackle that one?
You've got, it's the moderator,
Is
clearly.
that the moderator? No. Let's go to the next question. A serious response that on this, which is this is one of the reasons why CED's role and voice in this is so important right now. We are not coming at this from a political lens on either side, and we're trying to bring evidence-based policymaking. The conversation's not there yet. Hopefully it will be, and it's important on all of us who are in the room to be part of that voice to move it forward. So how's that for a no answer with a little bit better? Please.
Michael Byram, I'm a member of the CED team. The question basically for Mr. Barrett, or statement, and a question is that one of the things I know as a former CEO that he addressed that is not being addressed very much is corporate CEOs are absolutely afraid to tackle some of these issues and speak out because it is such a minefield for them. Some of them are unaware politically because of their socioeconomic backgrounds of saying the correct thing, saying the incorrect thing. They want to do the right thing, but the problem is they may say something that's judged so incorrectly. So we're in this era of political correctness, and I admire a lot of what JPMorgan is dealing with. I have direct dealings with a lot of their philanthropic group, and it's extraordinary, the example that they're setting. But is there some way for us to start to take out the penalties for people who speak out, who want to do the right thing, but may occasionally say the incorrect thing, and give them an opportunity to actually provide the leadership that they have to help us solve some of these problems that are eminently solvable?
George, do you want to try that? Not like you've ever had
I'll
any
try.
experience with that. So.
I don't really know how to answer that. Obviously, with the world as it is and social networking as it is, there's always some risk when you're in the public domain, and particularly in this seat. I would say this: it is increasingly important to, if we're going to be out on these subjects, to reinforce through our organizations sort of a consistency of our point of view. And it's hard to walk the talk every day. But so it puts a high pressure on doing that. And so I think, again, that's another thing. As the organization gets bigger, companies can be more reluctant because you know how hard it is to align everybody around who we really are about as an institution. But I think it's a battle. If we don't do this now, who will? I mean, I think we've got a right to, and a role to do this. But it does bring some risk. And it also requires a greater effort inside the organization to get alignment about what we are, what we stand for, and why we do the things that we do. So when we're very active in the community, the shareholders need to understand why we're active, and our employees need to understand why we're active. And I think to the extent that we're able to articulate why that's important, I think it takes the burden off us in doing this. Our employees essentially become, in a way, an extension of us and a voice of us. But I think there's probably always a bit of risk, and we have to decide whether we're willing to take that.
Great. We have time for one more question, and then you can respond to this one too if you. Daryl.
Thanks, Lenny. Daryl Brewster with CECP, the Corporate Force for Good, and another former public company CEO. It's actually encouraging to see a lot of CEOs stepping up on gender issues in the state of Georgia and in North Carolina now, and have started to reverse what was going to be public policy. And I think consistent with what we're seeing, that business take a lead and lead government versus the other way around. However, can we do that when I just checking on here that Jamie Dimon's net worth is essentially the same as what we're talking about investing in communities? How are we going to deal with that if we're going to talk a game without behaving that way? Not an easy issue. I've kind of been there myself on it, but how do we address that? How do we have credibility coming to the table if income is here, talking about income equality without adjusting that sum? Didn't want to make it easy for you.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a hard one to answer. I think the question is whether or not your actions in your organization reflect the things that you talk about. There are byproducts of being in a system, and Steve talked about that earlier, in which the rewards get distributed unevenly. And I think it's important for organizations to think about that and to think about how they best navigate effectuating some change. And I think some organizations do a much better job than others. But it does, again, it raises the challenges. Again, you are always at risk of a charge of hypocrisy or the eye rolling or whatever action we're talking about. I still don't think that should be a deterrent. I think the question is whether you build in your organization and in the communities that you serve a clear message about what you're about and how you're willing to commit and how you're willing to give back and engage in the activity that creates opportunity. And I think to the extent that you can do that, it diminishes a little bit of that pressure, but it's probably inescapable on some level.
Hi, William. So I'll just give you my perspective. I'll tie in kind of on both of the questions. As somebody who just 3 years ago was sitting on the other side of the table, in fact, that's how I met and got attracted into this position. So I think there's a couple of things that I would say for CEOs. One is on their kitchen cabinet, and again, approaching these challenges the same way they would kind of, as you said, strategy on anything else. Your point about this might not be a CEO's experience, it's not their personal experience, it's not their network experience, but they can hire talent in who has that experience or has the education background to understand and can get them smart on it. If it's not internal, it can be external. Who are the set of trusted advisors that are going to help get a CEO smart? And on this particular issue, you may still, it doesn't solve the problem of the tomato throwing on the occasional misstep, but it starts to sensitize, and I think that's important then to the follow-up, which is you're not going to change overnight CEO pay, maybe ever, I don't know. I'm going to preserve my job and not talk directly about that. But what I will say is, I think a theme of what we've been talking about is walking the walk. So if you're going to be out there talking about these issues, you're going to be far less of a critical target if, as an individual and as a company, you're following up that work with deep and substantive and credible action. And let me just give you an example of something that Jamie has done recently. Lest I get some of these details wrong, but the city of Detroit, for those of you who might be familiar, just huge, overwhelming blight issues, right? Nearly a quarter of the city's parcels are abandoned, vacant property, and they had been able to get large sums of money through the Hardest Hit Fund to actually demolish some of the worst properties, huge public safety issues, neighborhood valuation issues, the list goes on and on. That money had run out, and when the budget omnibus was rolling forward early this year, there in the totality of things that were in that omnibus was a little line in there that would have put additional money into the fund and allowed for greater demolition, not just in Detroit, but in blighted cities around the country. Jamie picked up the phone and called Speaker Ryan and called McConnell and others around the Hill and voiced support for this. And of course, when they pick up the phone, waiting to hear what his priorities might be, and they're like, wait, what? Demolition in Detroit? But in fact, several of these things had come together. I mean, Jamie already cared about these issues. He's the one who sent us to Detroit, but he has since spent a lot of time there and can tell that story on his own. And so when we brought this problem to him and said, hey, we have a chance to weigh in and use your influence to make this difference, it was like 2 phone calls. And it was huge. It was huge. So the more that we are out there doing those things, you're not ever going to get rid of all of the critics or all of the tomato throwing, but it starts to get really hard to make a credible case when you're actually walking the walk and you're using your influence in that way.
Okay, with that, I hate to cut this off because this is a really important conversation. I'd just like to ask you to one more time thank our panelists, Anu, Sandra, Janis, and George, for a fantastic conversation. And once more encourage you to not only read the CED's work on tackling economic inequality and boosting opportunity, but also, as we have here, engage the conversation with your companies, your communities. The conversation's already happening. The question is, are those of us who are in a position to help lead it going to be part of it? So thank you all, and look forward to the rest of the conference.